Hello and welcome back to Desperate Living, Cultural Chaos and Forgotten Stories. For those of you new here, we cover all aspects of popular and unpopular culture, and today we're looking into the history of one of the most controversial and misunderstood films ever made, Caligula.
They spoke of it first in whispers. Then it took the media by storm.
I have existed from the morning of the world, and I shall exist until the last star falls from the heavens. Although I have taken the form of Caius Caligula, I am a god.
Bob Guccione and Penthouse Films International present Caligula.
You amateur.
Amateur!
No treachery could equal his evil. No evil was more treacherous.
He's mad!
Caligula, the emperor who devoured Rome.
Growl! 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 I hate them!
Malcolm McDowell, Teresa Ann Savoy, Helen Mirren, Peter O'Toole, John Gielgud. No rumor can match the reality. Caligula, rated R.
As the new version of Caligula, the ultimate cut, hits UK cinemas, let's take a look back at the making and unmaking of the original film at the end of the 1970s. The mythology of Caligula has become one of the great movie stories, a tale of wild excess, clashing egos, and an ambitious project ruined by a barbarian pornographer. The writer and director had their names removed from the film, the stars lined up to condemn it, and the critics savaged it. Tales of unheard of levels of depravity during the film's production quickly became established as fact, and far from ushering in a new world of sexually explicit big budget cinema as the producer had hoped, Caligula instead became a name synonymous with self-indulgence, bad taste and cinematic awfulness. The new release of Caligula the Ultimate Cut, an interestingly titled project that used the 120 miles of film that director Tinto Brass shot and which had long been thought lost, sells itself entirely on this mythology. Here we are told is a film that could have been a masterpiece, but which was instead destroyed by the crass producer, the open-shirted, medallion-wearing Penthouse publisher Bob Guccione. Now, using this previously unseen material, the film has been lovingly reconstructed, removing Guccione's extra hardcore scenes and inserts featuring Penthouse pets like Annika De Lorenzo and Laurie Wagner, and reworking the film into the serious masterpiece that it was always intended to be. The problem with all this is that the story of Caligula is not quite as straightforward as you might believe. Caligula was shot in 1976 as Gore Vidal's Caligula, based on a screenplay commissioned by co-producer Franco Rossellini, a man who interestingly never gets any of the blame for the film's final outcome, make of that what you will. Vidal, the author of Myra Breckenridge and a noted man of letters, was nothing if not self-assured. He believed that the authorship of a film lay with the writer rather than the director, an interesting idea given that screenplays are routinely overhauled during both post-production and shooting, with the director and the editor generally making the final decision about what stays in and what goes out. He named the project Gore Vidal's Caligula in order to emphasise this belief, take ownership and impose a certain control over whoever the director might be. Guccione and Rossellini both wanted Tinto Brass, who seemed a fine choice. A deeply political filmmaker who'd risen out of the art house world, Brass had just made Salon Kitty, a very controversial film that also dealt with madness, obsession and sexual extremity with explicit scenes. Clearly, Brass would not be fazed by the sexual requirements of Caligula or by its political subtext. Gore Vidal, however, hated Salon Kitty with a vengeance, and so the search for a director continued, unsuccessfully until the author was told that Brass had been hired and he'd just have to live with it. The pair reached an uneasy understanding and worked on rewrites together as the budget exploded and Danilo Donati's extravagant sets demanded an altogether more fantastical, absurdist narrative than the one Vidal had originally written. Vidal's screenplay had been grimly serious, but Brass saw the film as a black comedy, even though he was very keen to keep the political subtext. Invariably, the two would soon fall out. Vidal did an interview in which he described film directors as effectively sheep who need to be led by the screenplay. And as you can imagine, this did not go down well with Brass, who then banned the author from the set. The production, including star Malcolm McDowell, mostly sided with Brass. Peter O'Toole, an old friend of Vidal's, hated Brass immediately, and his dismissive comments about how awful the film was, before it had even been completed, set the scene for the critical response to come. But Vidal was effectively frozen out of the project. He insisted that his name be taken off the film entirely. Guccione and Rossellini refused, and a protracted legal argument, not actually involving Vidal suing, it must be noted, ended up in an uneasy compromise. His name would be removed from the title, but the film was credited as being based on a screenplay by Gore Vidal. No actual screenplay author was listed. This wouldn't be the end of the film's odd production credits. After these opening arguments with Vidal, the production was actually quite smooth. For Guccione, though, there was always the suspicion that Brass was not sticking to the plan. He'd been taken on as a director for hire, and his contract stated that he had to follow Guccione's instructions to the letter. But that was never going to happen with an anarchic creative like Tinto Brass. When Guccione visited the set, Brass dutifully filled out the sets with penthouse pets. When Guccione left, they were pushed to the background or not used at all. Brass instinctively knew that these very 1970s glamour models would be more of a distraction than a bonus, and I think time has proven him right. The pets ground the film in mid-1970s erotica, while everything else feels oddly timeless. But once the film wrapped, Guccione took his revenge. He gathered up all the footage and took it to England, hiding it in cans labelled with fake movie titles because UK customs were already very aware of this film. Had the negatives been seized, that would have been it for the project. $17.5 million down the drain. In Twickenham, the film was edited by Russell Lloyd, while Brass worked on his own version next door. Guccione, meanwhile, snuck back onto the sets with filmmaker Giancarlo Louis to shoot several hours of hardcore scenes with penthouse pets and some supporting cast members who were there to ensure continuity. This was primarily a lesbian scene between De Lorenzo and Wagner that always felt like a bit of a clumsy insertion, and a series of close-ups in the film's climactic brothel scene, which actually, I would argue, works surprisingly well. You wouldn't know that these were additions unless you'd been told. However, he also extended the length of this scene considerably, meaning that Malcolm McDowell's dialogue is awkwardly repeated again and again. Once all the footage was safely in England, Brass was fired and locked out of his editing suite. He sued to regain control, but the case dragged on as Lloyd's edit continued. By all accounts, this edit of the film is fairly faithful to what Brass had shot, even using some of the director's own edited content. But inevitably, this version has vanished. Guccione then hired another editor, Nino Baragli, who, under the instruction of Giancarlo Louis, attempted to rework the film to match Gore Vidal's original screenplay. This meant removing additional dialogue that had been added by Brass, as well as other details not in the original screenplay. Yet of course the film that had been shot had already diverted from Vidal's version in tone as well as content. The resulting film was understandably disjointed. More edits ensued, along with new dialogue that had to be added to scenes where you could only see the back of somebody's head in order to make it match what was happening. It all began to feel very compromised. Tinto Brass refused to be credited as director, therefore Caligula has no director credit, a fairly unique moment in cinema. He is instead listed as principal photographer, with the closest to a director's credit being additional scenes directed by Bob Guccione and Giancarlo Louis. Russell Lloyd declined to be credited as the editor, so there is no credit there either apart from edited by the production, whatever that means. Caligula was finally released in 1980 to critical fury, which might be partly explained by the fact that there were no press shows. Critics had to line up to buy tickets just like everybody else, and they hate doing that. There was an unconventional US release. Guccione hired a cinema in New York, renamed it the Penthouse East, and played the film there exclusively, unrated. The ticket price was $7.50 at a time when the average movie ticket cost a third of that. This release pattern would then be repeated in cinemas that ran art house and foreign films in order to avoid any connection with adult theatres. In Britain, UK Customs tried to stop the print from entering the country. clearly unaware of the fact that it had actually been edited here, and eventually only agreed if the print was shipped directly to the offices of the British Board of Film Censors, where BBFC head James Furman, customs officers and Penthouse lawyers all laboured over creating a version that would be legally acceptable. Some alternative footage made its way into this print, who knows how or from where, and the film eventually had a reasonably successful, rather more mainstream UK release. Here's the original UK quad poster from our collection, which curiously retains the warning that nobody under 18 will be allowed into the theatre, even though, of course, the BBFC X rating ensured that anyway. The film remained a bête noire for UK customs for decades. I once shared lawyers with Penthouse, a long story, and they told me that even they were not allowed to import a tape for use in a legal case unless they guaranteed that it would be sent back to customs once the case was over. The film would not be passed uncut for UK release until 2008. Despite what you may have heard, Caligula was not a financial disaster. It turned a healthy profit and inspired many Italian copycats, from Joe D'Amato's Caligula The Untold Story and Bruno Mattei's Caligula and Messalina, both now available on Blu-ray, to films like Caligula's Hot Nights and Messalina, the latter produced by Franco Rossellini, using the original sets, with Annika De Lorenzo and Laurie Wagner repeating their roles. This was made in part because Rossellini feared that Caligula might never be released as the editing process dragged on for years. He obviously wanted to ensure some return on his investment. The film also spawned a soundtrack LP that came complete with a 12-inch single featuring a bizarre vocal disco version of the main theme. Sadly, we can't share that with you here, but a bit of ingenuity and you'll find it online. It's well worth checking out. There was also a novelisation by William Howard, in reality William Johnston, a writer who specialised in film and TV tie-ins, mostly based on popular sitcoms. It's fairly throwaway stuff, but it does have a slightly more coherent structure than the final film. Perhaps restorers should have read it at some point along the way. Notably, Gore Vidal does not get a mention anywhere in the book. It's easy for smug critics to dismiss Guccione as a barbarian pornographer, a man of low taste and low intelligence, but that's a dreadful bit of arrogant sneering from the kind of people who see erotic entertainment as inherently worthless. Guccione was a great photographer and a man who wanted to raise the bar, not lower it. Penthouse was a fantastic magazine at its peak, and we should remember that no one else was going to spend millions of dollars on a film like Caligula. A movie that, in whatever version it had been released in, was always going to push the envelope of acceptability. The primary myth of Caligula, that Guccione destroyed the artistic vision of Vidal and Barras, betrayed his cast and ruined the film, has been told so often that it has become the accepted truth. But each version of the film would have featured the sort of explicit sexual imagery that even in 1976 would have frightened off any other producer. People forget that Guccione's hardcore inserts represent a tiny part of a 156-minute movie and are, for the most part, seamlessly integrated. There are many explicit moments that Barras shot and many that exist in Vidal's screenplay. This was always going to be a film that shocked audiences and alienated critics. Just look at how every year we see narcissistic simpletons performatively booing challenging films at the Cannes Film Festival. The moral condemnation of Caligula puts it in the company of movies like Twin Peaks' Fire Walk with Me, David Cronenberg's Crash, and Taxi Driver. Not bad all in all. What's more, I'll defend some of Guccione's choices. While the lesbian scene between the two Penthouse pets is a clumsy addition that goes on for far too long, the hardcore inserts in the climatic orgy don't seem especially out of place. It feels like there's a willful misunderstanding of how films are edited when people complain about the wide shots cutting to these close-ups and the idea that brief clips of explicit sex don't belong in an orgy scene. It's laughably moralistic. Caligula is a tale of excess and extremity, the story of a man who had the power to do anything he wanted, and so did. A bit like Guccione himself, you might think. It's not a film that demands restraint. Certainly the version that we've seen up until now is an uneven production that obviously displays the chaotic post-production and conflicting interests, but in a way that's what makes it great. And I have to say that despite everything that happened, maybe because of it, I would argue that Caligula is a great film, one that is unique in the history of cinema. In a world where movies are ground out by production factories and all look and feel the same, Caligula is unlike anything else ever made. It's a movie that never allows the viewer to feel comfortable as it jumps from one moment of delirium to the next. And there's something rather admirable about that. Despite the claims of critics who, I would argue, protest a little bit too much, the sort who are quick to tell us that they never find erotic films arousing, just boring, though the sniggering reactions you would hear at press screenings told a different story. The film is never boring. It may be disjointed, but there's always something extraordinary on screen, the like of which you've probably never seen before and will never see again. It still shocks because it's hard to believe that anything this utterly unrestrained could have been made and released. Somehow Caligula becomes more than the sum of its parts because it's so conflicted and contradictory. It also feels like the final gasp of unrestrained 1970s cinema where boundaries were being pushed and taboos broken, censorship collapsing, and where people genuinely believed that hardcore cinema could eventually cross over into mainstream Hollywood, with explicit scenes included in major movies. People think of that as laughably naive now, but we forget how close we came. Brian De Palma wanted to make Body Double with hardcore scenes. European filmmakers like Bertolucci pushed the envelope. Movies like I Know Corrida scandalized the world. And only really the inherent conservatism of the American studio system and the dreadful rating system created by the MPAA, where the X quickly became a taboo rather than simply an adults only rating as it was elsewhere, kind of kept that from becoming a reality. Caligula feels like the closest we came to this convergence. A film with big name, respectable actors who all knew exactly what they were involved in. It's another part of the Caligula mythology that Malcolm McDowell, John Gielgud, Helen Mirren and the rest had no idea that the film would include explicit sex. Their objections, sometimes honest, sometimes disingenuous bits of face-saving, were to the Guccione inserts and to the edit of the film, not to the explicit sex scene that Brass shot and Vidal wrote. Both John Gielgud and Helen Mirren cheerfully referred to the film as pornographic, even as they were making it. And no one involved was duped into making a sexually explicit film while they thought they were making family entertainment historical epic. There's even an argument to be made that Guccione was the one being screwed. In a surprisingly frank interview that appeared in this edition of Penthouse, he makes it clear that both Vidal and Brass went off script. Vidal in delivering a screenplay that was full of gay sex, making it perhaps closer to Derek Jam and Sebastiani than anything, and so not the film that the thoroughly heterosexual Guccione had hired him to write, while Brass would shove the Penthouse pets into the background and instead fill the screen with what Guccione described in the interview as fat, ugly and wrinkled old women, and cast ex-convicts, thieves and political anarchists as the Roman senators. Which sounds kind of genius to me, but I can understand Guccione's complaint. There may never be a definitive version of Caligula. It's a movie that existed in several versions long before this new ultimate cut. As well as Guccione's edit, there was the edition put together by the British censors. There was an incoherent 90-minute R-rated movie, the UK video release from Electric Video that has alternative softcore scenes, the longer pre-release version, the Imperial edition from the 2007 DVD release that first attempted to reconstruct the film according to what Brass had planned, and most worthlessly of all, I suppose, the Channel 4 TV version that Mark Commode rather laughably suggested was close to a director's cut, even though it simply had all the sexually explicit content either cut or reframed. Notably, none of these versions were approved by or even involved Tinto Brass. And the new Ultimate Cut, my god, isn't that just a pompously arrogant title when you think about it? Is no different. In fact, Brass threatened legal action against this new edit for potentially crediting him as director. At the same time, he's shown no real interest in re-editing the film over the years, and he's now 90, so the chances of us ever really seeing the version that this most unique of directors and editors intended are effectively non-existent. What's more, the existence of this new, ridiculously named and entirely inferior Ultimate Cut means that there is now little chance that we'll ever see a serious attempt to reconstruct the original film properly, using all the additional footage from various cuts and the shooting script that Brass worked from. What a wasted opportunity. If you want to know more about what I think of the ultimate cut, you can read the full piece on the Desperate Living website, just follow the link below. Or you can sign up to our Patreon and watch the video review. It's cheap as chips to sign up, and you're supporting the work that we do on this channel, so it's a win-win. If you enjoy this sort of content, don't forget to like, share and subscribe. And please let us know in the comments which version of Caligula, if any, you prefer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.